Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Adrian. Thank you, everybody associated with APEC. This is my first time in your country, and I really am just absolutely uplifted to be able to hear the stories that we don't get to hear in North America about what you're doing and about how you're contributing to a worldwide awareness and worldwide improvement that I promise you, as bad as it might seem sometimes, is a massive improvement on when I first was introduced into this world, inadvertently, grant you, way back in 2000. Thank you for sharing all of your stories that I've had the pleasure of listening to, both in presentations and in conversations in the hall. I think that, the primordial benefit of conferences like this is indeed having to do with stories. And as our journeys into autism Asperger awareness keep going further and further with just the way philosophy works, where instead of answering questions, we're just learning more and more about how to ask deeper and better questions. That in essence, the progress is just something really beautiful to me for somebody who's been doing this for about 15 years or so. My bio is really a little bit complicated because I really have worn a lot of different hats and continue to do so in the Autism Asperger world. Yes, Tom, thank you. I write books. I have a column in the Huffington Post. I consult for schools and businesses. And I've been an executive director of nonprofits in New York City, one of which took recent college graduates on the autism spectrum and matched them up with Fortune 1000 companies in New York. And that was really more along the lines of tricking corporate America into hiring our folks, but that's another story. But the real thing that sort of, gave me a lot of exposure was in beginning an organization called GRASP, which when I was running it was the largest membership organization of adults who themselves were diagnosed along the autism spectrum in the world. We had 3, not just 1, not just 2, but we had 3 attempts in Australia. Unfortunately, it never worked out. But at the time that I left them in 2013, we had 28 national chapters and about 11,000 signed up, registered members. And it was all really based on the peer support concept that, just like breast cancer survivors and returning war veterans would need to have shared experience to not feel like a patient all the time, that the person running that group had the same juice running through everybody else in the audience, that created a very marvelous dichotomy, which up until that point had not been seen yet in the autism spectrum. And I wish I had the words for the instances in those groups where I would see somebody reveal something because they could trust that they weren't going to be shouted down and they weren't going to be criticized for the experience that prior, in the neurotypical world, they would have been shouted down for. And then the response they get is a tap on the shoulder. I've been there. I hear you. I wish I had the words to be able to describe that to you. So anyway, one of the things that I always have to say to people in presentations like this is that I'm really not as smart as I sound. And I'm going to prove that to you because this is a presentation in which I've taken 5 hours to present. And today I have 45 minutes. And don't worry, we're not going to rush it. We're going to have a good time with it. But to show you that I'm not so smart, what did I do? I added material. There we go. I added just 2 slides to just give you a little bit more about my personal background since we don't really all know each other that much. Up in the black and white photograph up there, that's me on my father's shoulders. And my father was a wonderful, wonderful guy who was a Marine Corps helicopter pilot who fought in the wrong war in Vietnam, and he was actually killed in the Vietnam War. And to the left of that, you will see me with my mother, who was 19 years older than I was, a single mother, a war widow at the age of 22. And when your mother is only 19 years older than you, very often it can feel like you're growing up with an older sister. So our differences or the difference between that and a normal mother-son relationship certainly had some interesting differences to it. And all throughout, there's me playing guitar, there's me on a boat looking, not so happy and stuff like that. And to the right, you'll see a shirtless passport photo. I promise you I wasn't trying to be rebellious. There's another story with that. But one of the things that really saved me as a kid was actually that stuff having to do with my father. Because I was the obstinate kid. I was the kid that a lot of the teachers didn't want around in that particular class. And if it hadn't been for the pity factor, oh, he's just behaving like this because he lost his father in a war that we all hate, they would have really chucked me out. And that pity factor allowed me to kind of stay within the confines and not have really horrible things happen to me like it had happened to so many other adults that I saw once I had started GRASP and started listening to their stories. I should say, again, it's not because I was anything brilliant, but simply because of virtue of what my job was in running GRASP, that you could argue, maybe your Mr. Atwood would argue this with me, but you could argue that I heard more stories from adults on the spectrum than anybody in the world. And it taught me a lot. And I think that everything that you're going to see after I get through these slides is infinitely more contributions from those old GRASP members than it is from me personally. But one of the things I want to put up here too, though, is that travel really saved me. And that shirtless passport photo is of a time in which I spent 5 months bumming around Eastern Europe, back when it really was Eastern Europe, not to age myself out here. The black and white photo in the bottom center, that's me during a time in which I was doing a rather sophomoric graduate thesis by living out of my car for 5 months, working odd jobs to pay for food and gas as I played an eighth rate Jack Kerouac, and Columbia University in New York was going to let me write about it afterwards. So I said, that's a cool graduate thesis. And part of what you learn in travel when you're on the spectrum is that not only, is there not one way of doing something, there's a myriad ways of doing things. And that is really, really helpful for you to decide, at least in the context that you have options. And I, being partially raised by grandparents, had known that too, because obviously my mother's generation and my grandparents' generation had very different ways of thinking about it. So once I started traveling for real and noticed that the world was my oyster, that's when things really started to improve. And the picture to the bottom right there, I put that up there for some of the parents who might be here, who have kids on the spectrum, whom maybe are not so popular with the teachers right now. I was that kid, and I would like to tell you something that I learned only later on in running the GRASP groups. And that is that in the short term, when kids like that don't know why they're supposed to be apologizing, and instead of apologizing when they don't know why they're supposed to be apologizing, throw it back in the teacher's face. This does make the short term very ugly, and I understand that. It's ugly with a capital UG, as a matter of fact. But the long-term benefit is a sense of self and much more of a possibility for confidence, which I'll talk about later. And too many of the adults in those GRASP groups who apologized when they didn't understand why they should be apologizing, it was they who I thought suffered the most anxiety and the lowest self-esteem as they became adults. And that's just a picture of my family right now. Wonderful, wonderful family at my son's high school graduation 3 years ago. So, enough about me. Here's sort of an outline of what we're going to be talking about here today. And again, a lot of this will be very brief. I'm not trying to convince you that you understand everything in a 45-minute presentation. If I'm going to succeed, it's because I'm going to give you little tidbits that make you think, wow, not only could we talk about every one of those slides for 5 hours on itself, we could probably talk about every bullet point in those slides for 5 hours on itself. So, my wife, the journalist, will always tell you that if you really want to understand a story, you start with what's the situation on the ground. And so we're going to talk about where things kind of stand today. And then, what do you do next as the journalist? What's the history? And I'm very briefly going to go over the history of autism and why we fight so much more than in areas of other diagnoses amongst ourselves. And then we're going to look at some potentially redundant charts. Hopefully they're not going to really be that redundant, but I want to show you how completely, objective, subjective our opinions are when it comes to interpreting behavioral differences. And I know that speaking to a multicultural audience, you will understand this, because this is not a diagnosis that we get from a blood test or an MRI. It's a set of interpreted behaviors. And behaviors are going to run through these things called cultural filters. And that is why global non-apparent disability statistics, you might as well throw in the trash sometimes. And I think that that's a good thing, not a bad thing. And then we're going to literally just throw a slide up for each one of these side issues: socialization, sports, sex, families, work, disclosure. Again, just to give you that teaser to show how much we could possibly be engaging with each other on each of those subjects. We'll do a closing and a perspective, and I wasn't sure if we were doing a Q&A, and maybe not, but I will also give you a slide at the very end of this presentation that gives you my contact information if you would like a PDF of this presentation. So, situation on the ground right now. We have the complexity of the spectrum. This is not muscular dystrophy or Down syndrome, okay? We have a very disparate autism spectrum with lots of famous people on one end and people with significant challenges on the other. And too often, this is something where average Joes and the neurotypical population really struggles with because they have a very human need to compartmentalize, okay? They need to know, they have a hard time, when they hear, well, this side of the spectrum really needs services desperately. Oh, and this side of the spectrum needs to get rid of their services because it's time for them to try this on their own because the rest of the world is now more ready to accept them. That's hard on the average Joe. And it's one of the reasons why we've had to struggle so much to get this information out. And the DSM-5 didn't help. Okay, we have nowhere near adequate school placements available still, however many years later. We have a plethora of butcherous clinicians. What does that mean? It kind of means that because one of the negative offshoots of so much autism awareness, and I do not say that in cynicism at all, it's been wonderful, but we have to understand that sometimes this is its own economic market now. And there very often will be clinical professionals, and I've seen them in my new home in the Midwest. I lived in New York City for 28 years, and we just moved to the Midwest, and holy cow, do the clinicians there have no accountability whatsoever amongst themselves. But if they need a payment on their third home in the Bahamas, then of course they're not going to refuse a patient when one of my guys calls up and says, hey, do you really know your Asperger's? And they go, yeah, I read the one page in the DSM-4. Sure, I know my Asperger's. Irreparable damage can come from such a relationship. Because just as our kids need to be taught differently in schools very often, so too do people need to be treated differently in a therapeutic session. So do your homework and get references before you call clinicians. 1 in 68, those are the prevalence numbers in the United States right now. It is a number that until that warehouse of adults like yours truly and many of you in the audience get cleared out, we're never really going to know what that prevalence number is. And yet at the same point, I think that that prevalence number is destined to grow anyway because the more that society allows us in because of our behavioral differences, we're going to get jobs, and we're going to date, and we're going to procreate. So I don't mean to give you this little, we're taking over the world kind of a thing here, but it's possible. What's out there for adults? Many of the parents here understand that one thing that is rather true on a global perspective is that whatever fight you had to get in to protect your kid and get that kid the services they need, I have bad news. What you've been experiencing is sometimes Disneyland compared to the services that are available once your kid ages out. We have problems. We fight. Right here. This is a game I like to play with sometimes audiences where I ask them, what's the first word that comes into your head? We don't have the time for a lot of the interactive stuff today, but I'll tell you that a lot of times people will say things like sad, traumatized. And this is a picture of a woman named Amanda Baggs. Many of you may know her. Amanda, if you're running an organization, a membership organization of adults on the autism spectrum, is, yes, a woman who is on the spectrum, and she is nonverbal. But Amanda also communicates through a facilitated device, and she has a blog, and she's really smart. And she can be a giant pain in the butt, okay, if you're an executive director making decisions about global stuff every once in a while. But you can learn a tremendous amount from Amanda. And I always have. And this is what Amanda has to say about this very picture of Amanda. This is what I look like when I'm trying to relax or zone out a little, or shut off vision so that I can hear what is going on around me. I have no doubt that someone could use this image to show the tragedy and despair inherent in autism. Black and white images such as these and the captions that go along with them are designed to create a reaction. Most often, disability organizations run by non-disabled people use them to elicit pity and money at the expense of the truth. Look at the autistic person in her own world, they say. Isn't it tragic? What I am doing in this photograph is no different than someone curling up with a good book to unwind after a long day. Some autistic people would even say that it's bad to publish pictures that look like this. Better to publish the ones that make us look like real people. Those are the better pictures. I say that plays straight into the hand of people who think there's something wrong with the way we look. And yet this is a list of a lot of those famous people also who have been diagnosed on the spectrum. It's a list from just 3 books. I can throw more names up there that are diagnosed from more books, and welcome to the complexity of the spectrum, okay? This is a chart that I sort of created that actually has some mathematical accuracy to it, where the size of the planets really does correspond to the budgets of those particular realms of organization at the time that I made the chart. But it is still full of emotional manipulation, and here's why. Because I put all the organizations that I don't like into darker areas so that they look like the Death Star from Star Wars. And of course I put my beloved GRASP, closest to the light. But I put this up here because I want you to get a sense, really, of how, I'll be honest, I sometimes barf when I hear us use the word community, because this is kind of who gets along with who and who doesn't. The figurative fight's around lots of things. It's around language, such as cure. We kind of won that battle, and I'm very happy about that. The vaccine debate, we kind of won that one too, but it won't go away. Aversives, which if you don't know what that means, it means what are you allowed to do to the very large person who is nonverbal in the home when they're having a terrible day and they come out the aid? And there's horrible stories having to do with this stuff. Okay, research, what kind of research? We sometimes say, well, all autism research is great. I don't think it is, actually, especially if you're being a little bit duplicitous and disingenuous with your audience and telling them that the research that you're using on genetics and nerve synapses and serotonin levels is going to help the average working family with a child of autism next week, just so that they'll come and walk in your walk for you. Okay, if you ever want to see some real funny video of just completely dysfunctional reactions to the autism world, look at how the vaccine folks took over the first ever congressional hearings on autism. I was one of 2 people who were on the spectrum who testified at those particular hearings. They're on I think it's the C-SPAN website, but it's dysfunction personified. So why do we fight so much? Where's some of the history beyond this, aside from the fact that our spectrum is so wide? Let's take a very quick look at that history. 1943, an American named Leo Kanner diagnoses or recognizes autism. Things he's looking for are an inability to communicate verbally, a preference of objects to people, a disliking of breaks in routine, and high intelligence. Remember that one. Remember that one. And just 1 year later, across the pond, this guy named Dr. Hans Asperger identifies Asperger's syndrome. He puts his own name on it. And the things he's looking for are an inability to pick up nonverbal communication, passionate interests, motor skills deficits, and an oddly exhibited use of the spoken word. But as we all know, before the 1940s, this is fascinating. Think of pick a place in history, or a culture on a different place in the planet, and you can have these incredible games where you just look at maybe how behavioral differences were interpreted, by the culture during the time in which you're looking at. Because really, sometimes it really can be that, he's the weird one, let's make him king. Oh, she's the weird one, kill her now. So it's very varied. So what happens after all this, though, is that Kanner's work spreads and Asperger's does not. Why? Well, there was this thing called World War II. And obviously, Asperger's work was done under the auspices of a Nazi occupation. And for very wise reasons, I think we look a little, with some skepticism at science being done under a Nazi occupation. And also, America wins the war, so everybody wants our blue jeans and our music, and also, in this case, our science. Asperger's work wasn't even translated into English until the early 1980s by Lorna Wing. And I think that this is fascinating because think for just a second, if at around the time of the turn of the millennium, that if we had known about both of these conditions in equal weight, think of how farther along we would be in our knowledge of all this sort of stuff. Because I don't know if any of you remember those early days or not, but Asperger's was just sort of thought of this weird, ugly step-second cousin to autism at the time. So now we go to the 1960s and the early 1970s, and some of you may or may not know this name, but he's very pivotal, especially in the United States. We had real rock star clinicians that were very, very famous in the United States. Whoever it was at the time, the United States would just basically buy anything they had to say or any theory they had, hook, line, and sinker. Benjamin Spock was another one that came along after Bruno Bettelheim. Bettelheim was famous, though, because he had a theory about autism, and he really was bringing the word to a forefront. And the theory of where autism came from, according to Bruno Bettelheim, was that you got your autism because your mother wasn't affectionate enough with you the moment after you were born. If some of you remember the term refrigerator mothers, this is where it came from. Now, obviously, a lot of you can probably imagine yourself as the mother in that situation. And you're thinking, I know I was affectionate enough with him. I know that. But the rest of the world believes Bruno Bettelheim. So what are you going to do? Are you really going to fight it? Do you really have that kind of strength? Maybe some people do, but most people don't. And eventually you just acquiesce, just like I used to acquiesce to being thought of as an asshole. You eventually acquiesce to the idea that, no, this must be my fault. It's just too hard to fight. So eventually say, okay, I'm sorry, this is something that I did. But the interesting thing to me is that nobody takes into account really just assuming a heterosexual family, unfortunately, but back in the 60s, let's face it, what did the dads think? This is my wife's fault. She did this to our child. What about the brothers and the sisters? What about the siblings? Don't expect any affection out of mom. Look what she did to my brother. And these were the days when parents were told, put him in a home and forget you ever had him. This man destroyed thousands of families. And we wonder why we might be a little subliminally messy-headed when we hear words like autism and Asperger's. Less so today. But still, this is our inheritance. This is our legacy from my country, which is economically the most prosperous on this planet, especially at this particular juncture in time. And this is what we did with that privilege. So some of the things that you would think of when you regard, the Bettelheimian version of autism, you've got the suggestion of bad mothering. Okay, forced separation is possible. Not forced, I shouldn't use that word, but they strongly advise putting the kid in the home. So it's logical then to avoid the diagnosis of autism, right? I mean, it's a bad word. You don't want that word in your family. And oddly enough, there's still some areas where Bettelheim's influence is unfortunately impactful today. We don't have the time to go through it, but we're finding those pockets. We're weeding them out. We're trying. Oddly enough, though, that whole Bettelheim iconography was really overthrown very quickly. Movements, whether they're suffragette movements or anti-war movements, usually take a very short time, a very long time to come to fruition. But the movement to overthrow the Bettelheimian way of thinking about autism was really overnight. It was very, very quick. But suddenly we went into the opposite extreme in the late 1970s and the 80s. We didn't find the emotionally healthy middle ground whatsoever. And we started to hear this phrase, why do you want to put a label on him? So what's starting to happen now is that, we're starting to resent the medical community or the psychoanalytic community for all these horrible things that the Bettelheim generation had done. And we're going to basically start to, skipping ahead to another slide, demonize diagnosis itself. And what's starting to happen around here this time is that a lot of moms especially are saying, you know what? I don't care what my kid has. I am going to love my kid with everything I've got, and if we do that, everything will be fine. So the diagnosis is still not really being talked about in the household. there's still those whispers. And I think we all know that when we take ownership of words, like especially in New York in the 1980s, when we finally started to use the word AIDS, that things only then started to get a lot better. Whenever we hide these words or we have to keep these in the background, that's when the bad stuff is usually going to be happening. And this movement wasn't a conscious movement, but just for the heck of it, we'll call them a movement and we'll give them a word, we'll give them anti-labelism. And the iconography of autism under the anti-labelist version had intentionally vague descriptions of all diagnoses as special. By keeping the aura surrounding the individual undefined, no one could prescribe anything harmful to the family dynamic. And there's logic in there, but there's also harm. Question is, was this anti-labelist version an avoidance of the stigma? Did these two eras really contradict each other as much as the anti-labelists had hoped? Because that's why they came into fruition, was to completely condemn the Bruno Bettelheim legacy. And I think the answer is a very comic, tragic no. I think that both of these eras did the same damage. Both prevented individuals from having a say in their care. In both eras, nobody is telling the individual, what you have is a thing called autism. You need to know what you have because you are different and you're not dumb, and you will notice that you are different from your peers. And if you do not have that word, you will assume, because you are in this neurological minority, that you are a second-rate human being and that there is something wrong with you. Because that is what we do. We assume in the negative when we don't have the knowledge in front of us. And that's the one binding thing that all human beings, I think, have, is you bring city kids into the country and they want to kill everything that moves. They're so freaked out. And you bring country kids into the city and they want to know why all these weird people aren't locked up. We do. We all fear the unknown. And both of these attached negative iconography to words like autism and Asperger's. So the seeds of where we are today, though, began in the 1960s when we first started to hear autobiographical accounts from Donna Williams, Temple Grandin, and challenging the idea that all autistics were incapable of communication. We're writing books, we're capable of communication. We also had clinicians like Oliver Sacks, who did all this stuff with the savants that are 20 times more brilliant than me, for certainly. Who could, he would do these PBS shows showing the kid who can be taken up in a helicopter, toured around the city, and then come back and do a charcoal rendering of the city skyline that is to exact mathematical proportion. He really highlighted a lot of that stuff and started to put some positive iconography towards the diagnosis. And then in the 1990s, we had the most important decade in all of this, obviously the DSM-4, and more books coming out by, who's that Stephen Shore guy? Wow. And they're writing second and third books. They're not writing one, let me tell you how awful my life was and then I'll get out of your way, book. They're writing second and third books. But one of the things that at the top sometimes gets neglected was an article by a guy named Jim Sinclair called Don't Mourn for Us. Jim is a guy on the spectrum that he and I have disagreements, about certain things, and he knows that I talk about them. But he wrote this article, which was really necessary at the time. And it's online if you ever want to Google it and read it. But up until that particular point, parents really had a difficult time separating their needs from their kids' needs. And so they would feel overwhelmed by not getting the services that they needed and not having the attention that they needed. And very frequently, though, they would say, my child's life is hell. When, let's say, their child, if they had a clean place to live and a decent diet and something to give them a sense of purpose during their day, and they just enjoyed looking at their strobe light or their picture book all day long, then they were actually perfectly happy. And Jim's article, Don't Mourn for Us, basically said, hey, parents, I think that just because you feel slighted by the fact that your child won't continue on, let's say, in the family tradition of going to Harvard Medical School, that you feel as though God or whatever has robbed you. And I think that the problem lies with you, not with your kid. This was a very, very pivotal sort of breaking point in the history of all this because parents were pretty ticked off by that article. But it started the conversations which got us to this particular place in time. And obviously the DSM-4 was what very first included Asperger's syndrome in it. As many of you know, beforehand, the prevalence numbers were 1 in 10,000 for the autism spectrum, and then it became 1 in 166 with that particular edition. And oddly enough, though, a lot of people see the inclusion of Asperger's syndrome as the sole thing that blew the prevalence numbers sky high, and that's actually not true. In the DSM-4, they actually changed the definition of autism, classic autism, as well, to include many, many more people. And they dispelled the notion that one size fit all. Some of the myths that we've since dispelled, okay, in all this history. You oldsters may recognize the time in which individuals on the spectrum were thought to be passionless. You know, the old Mr. Spock iconography, although Mr. Spock was the coolest thing on the planet. Humorless, again, we have no, particular sense of humor. And if you're making that medically ethic mistake of just because I can't see passion or a sense of humor in an individual, then it doesn't exist, which is a terribly stupid thing to do, especially having to do with autism. And what they were missing at the time, I think, was just that there are 2 layers of duplicity. Number one, we might have something very different trigger passion or humor. And the second of which is in how we display passion or humor. So if your only way of recognizing passion is by thinking of Luciano Pavarotti singing an opera aria or the way Alexander Ovechkin goes after a loose puck in a hockey game, then you might miss some things. No sexual appetite. Yeah, right, we've been down that path already. We're all great at math. We're not. Bullies are eventually punished by life. Remember that great fantasy we used to have, when we would imagine what happens to the bullies after high school? And we imagined that, because they bullied autistic Johnny, that their lives were miserable because their hearts were just so black and they just went from dead-end job to dead-end job and bad relationship to bad relationship. And then finally, on some rain-soaked night in a gutter, they're holding a bottle of booze in one hand and they're only 44, but just in the moment before their liver kicks out, the last thought before they enter into the great beyond is, I wish I hadn't bullied autistic Johnny. It was a great fantasy. Unfortunately, the statistics were telling us that bullies actually got great jobs after school, and in their later years were thought very highly in the communities in which they found themselves in. Luckily, that's changed too. Excuse me, 65 to 85% girls, girls. When did that change? I'm sorry, that's a total goof, wow. How long have I been using that slide and not noticing that? Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, exactly. Dysmorphic slides. Obviously, the diagnostic rate still holds in much greater preponderance for boys than it does for girls, but that doesn't mean that girls don't have it. It just means that we're spotting it a lot better in boys. And part of that is that obviously a lot of these symptoms, because again, they're cultural, and in our world, they go through this magnificent thing called gender expectation. That's one myth. Before we get to the gender expectation, one of the things that I still feel, though, that we're never going to be able to really progress in is until we get over this idea that the guy with Asperger's whose IQ is 180 is going to be happy and the nonverbal person isn't. And we've got to stop using the ability to communicate as the measuring stick for happiness. Because again, the description that I gave of that other individual who has a clean place to live, has a reason to get up in the morning, masturbates regularly so that he's emotionally functional, okay? He's gonna be a lot happier than the guy who tests off the charts, who nobody explains the social word to, but everybody expects him to be the CEO of a Fortune 500 company. And of course, everything falls apart for that individual. We have to find better quality of life markers for how to quantify happiness. So back to the girls though, okay? If, for instance, a boy doesn't make eye contact, this is getting better, but if a boy doesn't make eye contact with you and he shakes your hand, oh, there's something wrong with this kid, better get him looked at. Whereas if a girl doesn't make eye contact with you, she's shy. Now, that's a really stupid reason, but it still is a social phenomenon that will cause that boy to have a better chance of getting the diagnosis that could really help them. And then we come to the area of, let's say, an interest in sports. This too is getting better. But if a boy doesn't have an interest in team sports, there's still too many pockets of society that are going to be like, oh, well, something's really wrong with this kid, better get him looked at. Again, stupid. But that kid will still have the better chance to get the diagnosis that could really help them out. Whereas a girl that's not interested in team sports, she's feminine, leave her alone. Now, that's not mutually exclusive that you have to have an interest in team sports, but, and things get more complicated as adults. I hate to use a judgmental term like submissive, but if you were to take the stereotypically submissive adult male, that person usually will not, or will have some difficulty finding a quote-unquote mate, and society judges people, adults that don't find mates or partners, and it's stupid, but that male will have a better chance of getting that diagnosis again. And very often, in the case of females, they do have a higher chance of actually finding a mate under that submissive umbrella, but unfortunately, that's where the majority of our abusive relationships come in. And Emma spoke to that a lot better than I can. So, what I want to do just very quickly, I'm going to whip through these. I just want to show you how subjective sometimes our opinions of behavioral differences really can be. I'm going to whip through some charts called the New Look. We're just going to look at a characteristic of autism in the left-hand column. And then in the center, we're going to do a critical interpretation, sort of that nihilistic, critical way of looking at things that erupted from the 1950s. And then we're going to find a hippy-dippy, crunchy granola, feel-good column to maybe interpret that difference a little bit, differently. Intense absorption in a topic or field of interest. The individual is obsessed and is driven further into this absorption by anxiety and stress. Individual is passionate. Okay? One person's passionate is going to be another person's obsessive. Professorial monotoned manner of speaking. Stilted awkwardness that is off-putting to others, often preventing further steps in a potential relationship. Focused on being clear in what is being said by utilizing a strength, text. These charts are from my first book, by the way, and there's 17. We're not going to do all of them. Discomfort or inability at small talk sees no logic in it. Off-putting and impolite. Gets to the point. For many, this is very refreshing. I want to clarify something, though, here, okay? Neither one of these two columns is any more right or wrong than each other. But if you err on the side of the positive interpretation, and you understand that you have a choice, and that you don't have to instinctively go to the negative, not only is the individual that you're referring to going to have a better shot at happiness throughout their lives, but your relationship with that individual will be stronger, and their capacity to trust you will be stronger. Problems, see if you can figure out what I do. Actually, you know what, we're running out of time a little bit here. But I play a trick with people with these two slides. If you look at a great technical mind, okay, that's exactly the opposite of a great creative mind. And I tell people to see if they can see me make the trick with those last two slides, because all I'm doing is flipping them. You can take all the clinical sounding language that's being used in that and just throw it in the gutter, because all I'm doing is just showing you by flipping the columns how subjective you might be to behavioral differences. It says whatever comes into their head unaware of the potential damage the statement might cause. The individual is rude. The individual is honest. I think that if we were to sum up everything that I want to convey to you, or that everything that I think we've learned over the last 15 years is it's corny, but our attitudes towards our lives end up meaning so much more than our actual lives in terms of the impact that they might have. We're getting now to those slides, and we're just going to kind of flip through a little bit. Socialization is something that parents usually want for their kids, but I've been told by not one, but two Chinese American friends, this socialization thing of yours, I don't really get it. I mean, my parents want me to be smart and work hard. Why do you value socialization so much? And that, too, is something that you can look culture by culture, and you'll find a different answer in. Common connections, usually, what we're passionate about, we're very, 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 very passionate about. We can be passionate about stupid things and we can be passionate about smart things just like everybody else, but the degree to which we put ourselves into something, that's where the difference usually is. And if you can set kids up who love the same thing together, that's usually how a relationship will sometimes happen. I'm big on sports. I'm just gonna click now because I think it's been a very overlooked part of life that's been denied a lot of people on the spectrum. I understand why. The bullying instances come from a lot of athletic kids. We've also heard about the jerk, soccer coaches that might have made things horrible for kids on the spectrum. I'm gonna flip through sex as well. But sports to me is the area where, we are allowed to display certain emotions that have no place anywhere else. And that we are allowed to get out feelings on those courts, those fields, those rinks that just have no place in the date, that comes 20 years later or the job interview. And I think that that's been stolen from kids on the spectrum because parents are afraid sometimes of dealing with the emotions of how to win gracefully and lose gracefully. And the biggest loss has to do with competition. Many people on the spectrum, and they certainly realize this and grasp, we are terrified of competition. And that's not right. Because in life, we compete with each other, whether we like it or not, for girlfriends and boyfriends. We compete with each other for jobs. In New York, we compete with each other for apartments. It's a part of life. And if we're afraid of competing, our lives are going to be less in terms of what we're able to accrue, whether it's the Australian dream or the American dream or what have you. And getting comfortable and knowing that I'm not going to die if I look this person straight in the eye and I say, I'm gonna beat you in this game. I'm gonna beat you. That's healthy, folks. That's healthy, especially because you can put it into context because you've been given the opportunity to learn and fail until you understand the context of competition. Sexuality, I'm just looking to see a lot more of again, I don't want to tread on, Emma's talked about this enough. I'm really looking more for the language about health, about law, about safety to be maybe put into a different context. Because the one thing that I think does get lost every once in a while is that sex is actually pretty cool. And that I think my fear every once in a while is that we are teaching kids that we never want them to have really wonderful sex. Because there are lots of people that are not going to have great careers. And there are lots of people that are not going to have great reciprocal relationships. And this could be a really wonderful component of their lives. So let's stop with people feeling shamed about what they want in life, have them listen to a lot of the warnings that Emma might have had, that you heard from Emma, and then talk about how fantastic sex is. It is fantastic. I'm not going to back down from that. Families. Master's degrees in neuroscience, we don't really get those, unfortunately. There's the stigma of the aforementioned history. Families don't get a break from one another, okay? And there's the genetic nature. Many of us have those parents that it's obvious to everybody else, but they're really having a hard time going to the clinician's office and looking under the hood. Well, it's usually advisable to get that person to look under the hood. Moms, dads, if you're afraid to look under the hood, understand something. If you get a diagnosis, you don't have to tell everybody. But it will really help you and it will help your kid, okay, to know, or that you know what you have so that you understand where you're coming from. The work spectrum. I would give a game, what's the most behaviorally pluralistic part of life that you can find yourself in, and that would be the arts and university life, and what would be the most restricted, and that would be the military. And then I would tell you that, oddly enough, the military is heaven for a lot of people on the spectrum because they're going to tell you how to behave from the moment you wake up until the moment of lights out. It's a little can of worms, especially in the United States, but I think there's many of us that thrive in the military. And of course, unfortunately, though, we all have to do the 9-to-5 job where the social rules are never explained and they're different in every arena we might find ourselves in. And then, of course, there's the importance of disclosure. There's the who, the how, the when, and the why. No diagnosis is ever going to be the bad guy. If you really want to be able to criticize something, you can try and look to eradicate things like anxiety, things like anger, things like depression. and for us sometimes distrust. It is hard for us to trust the rest of the world when they have not shown that they get us. And the hardest thing I would have to say to my fellow Spectrumites is that every once in a while we do have to go out on a limb and trust them even when we don't. We just won't learn sometimes. Confidence is the main key, and that's what I want people on the spectrum to have. Confidence doesn't care what university you came from. Confidence doesn't care what your body looks like. Confidence doesn't care what resources you have at your disposal. And it's a mental trick. And it's one that we can all accrue so long as we have the right transition plannings. Best description of the entire spectrum that I've ever heard came from a 5-year-old kid. And this kid had a kind of good relationship with his pediatrician. You know, they could kind of bust each other's chops a little bit. And the kid said to, the pediatrician said to Dylan, who was 5 years old, "I know what's going on with you. You've just got too many wires." And Dylan said, "No, doctor, my problem is that the wires aren't insulated well enough." Okay? The whole notion of failure. Starting as early as possible, we need opportunities to practice independence, and we need opportunities to fail. We don't learn to get over the fear of failure until we've failed many, many times, and we get that thick skin that allows us to know that if we fail, we are not going to die. We're going to get up, and it's going to be okay. Biggest obstacle is that no one wants to please more than us. And again, obsession, passion, well, wants to please will always be can't handle rejection to some people. There are 2 wonderful words I would like everybody to know. First is so. I like it when I hear Spectrumites say this word. To close in perspective, we are talking about one aspect here of what makes a human being a human being. There's gender, there's race, there's economic background, there's sexual orientation, there's neurological makeup, which we're talking about here today. There's quality of supports, and lastly, there is culture. One of these is infinitely more important than any of the others. Which one do you think it is? Quality of supports, that is correct. If you are raised to feel good about who you are, no matter who you are, you've got a shot. If you're not raised to feel good about who you are, you're going to have a harder time. This is my moment of shameless self-promotion. That's my first book that was mainly intended for adults being diagnosed, called Asperger's from the Inside Out. It's actually 9 years old now. Wow. And my second book, Unemployed, on the autism spectrum. Please be on the lookout for my third book within the next year, the book of happy, positive, and confident sex for adults on the autism spectrum, ... and beyond. If you would like a PDF of this presentation, please email me at that address, or you can contact me through my website. If you like to do things like Facebook, it's all Michael John Carley, and I would be happy to oblige any questions, any concerns. And I will tell you, Americans know of a woman named Helen Keller, and those of you who have read my first book know who Helen Keller is. But for those of you who don't, Helen Keller was a woman who was visually impaired, hearing impaired, and had extreme cognitive difficulties. A lot has been written about her because so much progress was made of her at the beginning of the 1900s. And if Helen Keller can understand that we're never going to be perfectly safe, that is a concept that really doesn't apply. And I can tell you in a post-9/11 America, her words to me resonate stronger than they ever possibly could, that security is a superstition. It does not exist in nature. Life is either a daring adventure or nothing. And I'm not a Freud guy. Freud was very weird. He slept with his patients. He had crazy theories about lots of stuff. But Freud had one really, really brilliant thing to say. And that was, he said, if you really want someone to change, then you have to change. I've been listening to your stories for 4 days now. Today you've heard mine. And just thank you for everything that you've given me, but especially, as always, thank you for listening to the local Spectrumites in your neighborhoods. Thank you very much.